Welcome to Chapter 8. We're going to look at the late Baroque period, and we're mainly going to look at the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. The late Baroque music. This is an era of refinement and culmination, not of musical innovation. Well, what does that mean? First off, composers of the late Baroque era, they're using the same genres that they were using in the previous generations. So we're still writing operas. We're still writing a lot of concertos. We're writing, the concerto grossos, solo concertos. We're writing cantatas as well. A lot of these composers, they're not developing new forms, but what they're doing is they're kind of reinventing or making older forms more innovative. One of the main ways that they're making them more innovative is through the use of counterpoint. So with Bach, you're going to see he, reintroducing counterpoint to the late Baroque musical texture. We're going to see a lot of counterpoint in his cantatas. We're going to see a lot of counterpoint in a musical genre called a fugue. So Johann Sebastian Bach. When we look at his life, they divide his life up into three periods. And if you look, we have Weimar, Cothen, and Leipzig. And Bach lived for a substantial time. He lived from 1685 to 1750. And keep that in mind that he dies in 1750, and the Baroque era, Baroque era is the end ends in 1750. And it's no culmination that with the death of Bach, we're ending this era. So with his career, we look at three periods. His earlier period in Weimar, he was an organist, and he just wasn't a regular, run-of-the-mill church organist. He was an organ virtuoso. He definitely he took the organ, playing the organ to like the next level. He was extremely great at improvisation with the organ, and also he was paid as a consultant. So if I was a pastor at a church and we were going to install a new organ in our church, we would go consult Bach and have him come out to make recommendations on who's going to build the organ, where they're going to put it, maybe what pipes to use. So he definitely was sought after as a renowned organist of the time. When we look at his period, the middle period in Cothen, he goes away from writing organ music and starts writing more orchestral music. The Duke of Cothen has a top-notch orchestra, and with that, he's the court composer. He can write for this top-notch orchestra, and he can write difficult music for this orchestra. And then finally, his final period is probably the majority of his life he spent in Leipzig. And in Leipzig, he was the cantor at a church in Leipzig. And he was responsible for writing all of the music for this church. In addition, in Leipzig, they had a couple other churches around, so he'd be responsible for writing music for like 4 or 5 different venues. So you're going to see a lot of sacred music coming out of the third period. But as his reputation, he comes from a long line of musical Bachs. His parents were into music, and his siblings were into music as well. Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach is probably one of the most popular. So one of his sons is one of the most popular composers in the early classical period. He was a renowned organ virtuoso, and he's most famous for writing cantatas and then fugues. And also, he was a great composer of counterpoint. The first genre that we're going to talk about is a fugue. And a fugue is a polyphonic composition with 3 or more voices. The one thing we need to remember is when we hear the term fugue, we're going to associate with polyphony. It's going to be multiple voices interweaving or interacting with each other. Now, when we have a fugue, we're going to have specific terminology that's associated with the fugue. So we're going to use terms like a subject, exposition, and episode. A subject is the main idea or the principal theme for a fugue. It's like the main melody. Okay. An exposition, it refers to the opening section where each voice presents the subject. when we have an exposition to a fugue, there are very specific rules for how the subject is presented in specific key areas, in specific intervals, and so forth. And then one other term that we want to be familiar with is the idea of an episode. And the episode is a free section of counterpoint where the subject isn't heard. And usually we'll have the exposition, then we'll have an episode where the music is polyphonic and it's moving, it's either modulating to a different key area, and then we'll hear the subject come back again in different voices. If we look at this slide, it's a typical plan for a fugue. So we're going to have the four voices. If you look over here, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. With this specific fugue, we'll see in the blue area, this is the subject. The subject gets presented, and then the soprano is going to play the subject. While the soprano is singing the subject, in this red area, the tenor is going to switch over and play what we call the counter subject. It's going to be a melody against the subject. Continuing, the alto will play the subject, and while the alto is playing the subject, the soprano line will play this counter subject, and the tenor will probably improvise on free counterpoint and new material. Finally, the bass will play the subject while we have other counter polyphony above the bass line. We then continue to an episode, free counterpoint, and then we'll modulate to an area, and then the subject will get reintroduced. Usually when composers reintroduce a subject, they'll be using other compositional devices like augmentation or diminution, where they're kind of stretching the melody out or making the melody smaller. The composers may even invert the melody, kind of flip it upside down. And the idea is composers are going to show you how crafty they can be with taking the subject and all the different variations that they can do with a fugue. So the fugue we're going to listen to today, it's by Bach. It's an organ fugue in G minor. It was created about 1710. So it was written for Bach. It was actually written during that middle period in Weimar. It was written for the Duke of Weimar. It's a four-voice fugue for SATB. It's written for organ, and so one thing I want to point out real quickly is one of the best instruments to play fugues or any polyphonic texture is going to be on an organ. And if you look at here, you can see down here, the organ is going to have several layers of keyboards. Each of these keyboards is called a manual, and you can set up these manuals to have different timbres. On the stop, there's little buttons on the stops of organs called stops. You press a couple of these stops, and it will change the timbre for the manuals because it's changing the pipes up in the rafters. So you have multiple manuals that you can play. In addition, with an organ, you have a series of pedals. And the pedals are not like a piano's pedals, where you have like two or three. The piano's pedal, like a damper pedal, you press down on the piano, and it just keeps the sound, so forth. The pedals on an organ are different because they're structured just like a keyboard. And what you will do with your feet is you can play melodies, you can play pedal tones with your feet, adding another layer to the music, which makes the organ a great instrument for playing polyphony. Let's go listen to Bach's organ fugue in G minor. So let's start off by listening to the subject. Next, we'll listen to the rest of the exposition. It's going to start with the alto playing the subject, and the soprano is going to be playing the counter subject. After the exposition, we'll have an episode. Let's go listen to this episode. And then finally, another thing that we could have in a fugue is a pedal point. So when we listen to this next excerpt, let's listen for that bass line that's sustained while the other parts are moving above it. So the piece we're going to listen to today is a Brandenburg Concerto. There was a series of 6 concertos written from 1715 to 1721. They were actually a series of concerto written and presented to his prospective employer of Christian Ludwig of Brandenburg. There was a job he wanted to do. He wanted to get in Brandenburg, so he writes out these series of concerto, and then submits them as like kind of as an audition. He didn't get the job, I believe, but either way, we have 6 of these phenomenal pieces. The Brandenburg Concerto are very, very important pieces in the Baroque repertoire. I believe the second Brandenburg Concerto is one of the concertos that's recorded, and it's actually saved on there's a disc on Voyager 1 or 2 where they got sent into space, and some of Bach's music is on this as well. Again, I guess the people at NASA felt that this was a representative piece of what humanity has to offer. Little tidbit. The Brandenburg Concerto, though, just remember, they're going to be it's a set of concerto, but it's the Concerto Grosso or Concerto Grossi. So we're going to have a small group called the Concertino group versus the orchestra. Bach's Brandenburg Concerto number 5. It's a Concerto Grosso. The form of it is going to be ritornello form. So we're going to have this orchestral ritornello that comes back again and again. And the piece is going to feature the concertino, which is that small group of soloists, versus the orchestra. In this case, the concertino is a solo violin, flute, and harpsichord. And you have the separation between tutti, which means everyone, and the concertino. In this work, it's not as distinctive as other concerto. The ritornello is is the main melody that's going to keep for the orchestra. That's going to keep coming back. And then later on, towards the end, we're going to see a cadenza. And a cadenza is a term we want to know because, especially when we get to the classical era, at the end of concerti, the orchestra is going to stop and the soloist is going to play these cadenzas. And what's a cadenza? Well, it's a solo. That's a showy passage for soloists towards the end of a movement. Basically, the orchestra stops to take a break, and it's a way for the soloist to show how virtuosic they are. During the Baroque period, many of these cadenzas were improvised. Once we get to the classical period, the style of improvisation kind of dwindles out, and a lot of these cadenzas are written out beforehand. But they're still very, very flashy and very, very virtuosic. Let's go. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to go back, and I'm going to play you an example of the concertino. Then we'll listen to the ritornello, and then we'll listen to a cadenza. So the concertino is going to sound like this. So again, when we go through and listen for what the concertino, then listen to the orchestra as well. So this ritornello is something that's going to keep returning, throughout the piece, throughout the concerto. Let's listen to the main ritornello. again, that's the example of the ritornello. And then finally, towards the end of the piece, we're going to hear a cadenza. This cadenza is the harpsichord is going to play, and it's going to be like a showy kind of passage. Let's listen. Okay. So again, let's go back and let's listen to the Brandenburg Concerto all the way through. And what we want to listen for, it's going to start off with the ritornello, with the orchestra, and then you're going to hear the concertino, and it's going to be kind of like a battle between the two, like a give and take. So these are the things we want to listen for when we listen to a concerto grosso. So we have Bach in Leipzig. Now, this is his third period. In 1723, Bach becomes the cantor at St. Thomas's Church and Choir School. And his main job was to organize music for the four principal churches throughout the city. He also played the organ for weddings and funerals and civic events. He also taught at the boys' choir. So this was a very, very big role for him. In addition, he was composing music for each Sunday and for religious holidays. And keep in mind, you have 52 Sundays in a year, plus specific holidays, church holidays like Easter, Lent, and Christmas. And his main music that he would compose for the church were these cantatas. And he wrote over 300 cantatas throughout this period. And his main goal was to write enough sacred music that he could perform a 3-year cycle without having to repeat any of these cantatas. The cantata. So a cantata is a multi-movement sacred work. It includes arias, ariosas, recitative. It's performed by soloists, a choir, and a small accompanying orchestra. Most of these cantatas Bach would conduct from the keyboard, while playing the continuo part. He wrote over 300 of these cantatas. About 200, have survived today, and they're performed. They're performed today usually as a concert. They're not really performed as a Lutheran service. Back in the day, in Bach's time, they would have been performed throughout the Lutheran service of the day. So the cantata we're going to look at is called Wachet auf. First off, we're going to listen to the second movement in a second. It's a 7-movement church cantata. Most of his cantatas were about 7 movements. And if you look at, they usually always start with the choral, a big choral setting for the first movement. The second movement is going to be a recitative. And the third movement is an aria. The fourth movement is a chorus. Fifth movement's recitative, the sixth movement's an aria, and then the final movement's a chorus. And the basically singing the chorale tune, the chorale melody. So a lot of the recitatives function as the singer, which was sung by a tenor, will be like the narrator of this cantata. So in this example, we'll listen to, it's going to be the tenor and the basso continuo underneath. So the strings and the small organ will be playing underneath. But it's very, very sparingly because it's a recitative. The text is, he is coming, the bridegroom Christ is coming. You daughters of Zion, come forth. His root runs down from the heights into your mother's house. Let's listen to this recitative.
Der Bräutigam kommt, ihr töchtet sie, es kommt heraus, sein Ausgang eilet aus der Höhe in euer Mutterhaus. Der Bräutigam kommt, der einem Reh und jungen Hirsch gleich, auf den in Hügeln springt und euch das Mahl der Hochzeit bringt. Wart auf, ermuntert oft, den Bräutigam zu empfangen. Dort, seht, kommt der Herr gegangen.
In the next example, we're going to listen to the fourth movement of Bach et al., which is choral movement. Music's based on a traditional chorale tune or chorale melody. Let's listen. In the next example, we're going to hear a string melody or a counter melody while the chorale tune is playing, and there's going to be the bass line. And this is a polyphonic texture that exists in many of these cantatas. Let's listen. Now, in the final movement of this cantata, we're going to hear the chorale melody again for the written for the chorus. But it's going to be the soprano singing the melody while the chorus is singing harmonies or harmonizing the melody. And every single cantata ends with this chorale melody and this chorus singing the entire chorale melody. Let's listen to this. So let's go back and let's listen to the entire cantata all the way through so we get the full effect. So we will listen to the arias, the recitatives, and the choral movements as well. Another thing to quickly talk about is Bach's keyboard works. So towards the later keyboard works, there's two pieces that we want to look at. The first is the well-tempered clavier, and the second is the art of the fugue. So the well-tempered clavier, it's a series of 24 preludes and fugues, originally written for harpsichord, but it's normally played on the piano now. Each of them is made each of them is in all the major keys and minor keys that are available. And a prelude basically is a short kind of technical piece, to kind of warm up, and then a fugue, like the fugue which we talked about. So actually, there's two books. But there's 48 of them to total. But so he writes this well-tempered clavier, and it's a great kind of educational piece for pianists. And they're also wonderful pieces to play in a concert setting as well. The second piece that Bach writes is the art of the fugue. And it's a series of 19 canons and fugues. And they call it an encyclopedic treatment of all known contrapuntal procedures. What Bach does is he takes this fugue subject and he kind of shows us what he can do with it. He shows us every single kind of contrapuntal variation that's available with this, and it's a really kind of a testament to counterpoint, and it's also a kind of a testament to Bach's genius as well. So this is the end of Chapter 8, Johann Sebastian Bach. Let's make sure we go back and we listen to the cantata. Let's listen to the Brandenburg Concerto, and let's go listen to the organ fugue in G minor as well. Thank you very much, and I look forward to talking more about classical music.